For 6 months, if anyone in Camden Town asked after Kora Crippen, the answer came easily from her husband, delivered with the mild, apologetic warmth of a man slightly embarrassed by his wife's dramatics. She had gone to America, family business, urgent and unglamorous. She would write when she could. He said it to her friends at the Music Hall Ladies' Guild. He said it to the neighbours at 39 Hilldrop Crescent. And for a while, in a city as large and as indifferent as Edwardian London, it was enough. It held while his young secretary began appearing at his side in public wearing Kora's furs and Kora's jewellery. It held while he wrote to the Guild some weeks later to report that Kora had died suddenly abroad of pneumonia, a small, sad, forgettable notice that closed the matter for almost everyone who heard it. It held right up until the moment two of Kora's oldest friends in the Guild decided that a husband who could not quite keep his story straight deserved a visit from Scotland Yard, and it kept holding, astonishingly, for several minutes more, right there in his own front parlour, with a chief inspector sitting across from him asking gentle, ordinary questions. Tonight we revisit a case that changed criminal investigation itself. The first manhunt in history to be settled not by a tip from an informant or a lucky sighting at a railway station, but by an invisible signal sent across open ocean. One doctor, one buried body, one wireless telegram that outran the ship carrying him toward what he believed was freedom. The case of Hawley Harvey Crippen begins in Coldwater, Michigan, in 1862. In a country his eventual crime would never technically touch, though it would follow him across an ocean all the same. He trained first as a homeopathic physician in the eclectic medical tradition popular in late 19th century America, a discipline that gave him the title of doctor without ever quite anchoring him inside the more rigorous, more scrutinized world of conventional medicine. He married young, was widowed young, and in 1892 married a 17-year-old aspiring singer named Kunigunde Makamotsky, a woman with far more ambition than the modest talent that would ultimately let her realize it. She would go on to perform under a stage name of her own choosing, Belle Elmore, and it was under that name, rather than her birth name or her married one, that most of London's music hall world would come to know her. Crippen's professional life brought the couple to London in the 1890s, where he worked for a series of patent medicine companies, the era's flourishing and only loosely regulated trade in remedies that promised far more than any of them delivered. It was steady, respectable adjacent work, the kind that let a man in a stiff collar call himself a doctor without ever quite practicing medicine in the way the word implied. Kora, meanwhile, poured her ambitions into the London music hall scene, and, when her own performing career never quite caught fire the way she hoped, into the Music Hall Ladies' Guild, an organization of performers' wives and widows where she found precisely the social standing and the audience for her own personality that the stage itself had never fully given her. By the time the couple settled at 39 Hilldrop Crescent in Camden Town in 1905, their marriage had, by every account that survives it, hardened into something closer to mutual tolerance than affection. Kora was, by multiple contemporary descriptions, a large, forceful, socially ambitious personality who dominated the household and its finances. Crippen was quieter, smaller, more retiring, the kind of husband more easily overlooked in his own home than noticed in it. Into that widening gap walked a young woman named Ethel Leneve, who worked as Crippen's secretary and typist, and who became, sometime in the early years of the new century, his mistress in every sense but the legal one. There is a version of this story that reduces Kora Crippen to nothing more than a nagging, difficult wife whose murder her husband's defenders have, for more than a century, treated as almost understandable. That version does her no justice at all. Whatever her flaws, and every human being carries some, Kora Crippen was a woman who had crossed an ocean at 17 to build an independent identity for herself under a stage name of her own choosing, who found, when the spotlight itself proved elusive, a genuine community of women in the guild, who valued her energy and her company, and who trusted the man she had married for 18 years enough that his account of her sudden disappearance was at first simply believed. She does not deserve to be remembered primarily as an inconvenience. She deserves to be remembered as a woman who was, by the account of nearly everyone who actually knew her, very much alive and very much present in the world right up until the last weekend of January 1910. If you find value in stories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Now, back to the record. On the evening of Monday, the 31st of January 1910, the Crippens hosted a dinner party at Hilldrop Crescent for two old friends from the music hall world, Paul and Clara Martinetti. It was, by every surviving description, an entirely ordinary evening among people who had known one another for years, the kind of unremarkable social gathering that fills the calendars of thousands of London households every week, without anyone involved suspecting it will ever need to be reconstructed for a court of law. The guests left in the small hours of the following morning, sometime around 1 o'clock. It was the last time anyone outside that house ever saw Kora Crippen alive. What happened inside 39 Hilldrop Crescent in the days that followed is not, in its full and certain detail, something this record can claim to know with total precision, because the only two people who could ever have described it fully were the woman who did not survive it and the man who spent the rest of his short life explaining it away. What is documented is what came after. Kora Crippen did not appear at the next meeting of the Music Hall Ladies' Guild. Her husband explained, when asked, that she had been called away suddenly to America on urgent family business. Weeks passed. Ethel Leneve began appearing at social functions on Crippen's arm, wearing furs and jewellery that several of Kora's friends recognized immediately as her own. By late March, Crippen wrote to the Guild to report, briefly, and with what several members later described as a curious absence of real grief, that Kora had died in America of pneumonia somewhere on the Pacific coast, and that the matter was, as far as he was concerned, closed. Pause. Sit with the arithmetic of that story for a moment, because it does not add up the way a grieving husband's story should. A woman who had built a genuine social world for herself in London, a community of friends who saw her regularly, relied on her energy, and valued her company at every meeting of the Guild, simply vanishes across an ocean in a matter of weeks. She dies with no funeral her London friends are ever invited to. She dies with no grave anyone is given an address for, no coffin, no clergyman, no date beyond the vague shape of an American spring. And within that same short stretch of time, she is replaced almost immediately by a younger woman wearing her furs and her jewelry at the very same social functions Kora once attended herself. If that arithmetic unsettles you as much as it eventually unsettled Kora's own friends, take a moment now to subscribe, and tell me in the comments what detail in a case like this you think should have triggered suspicion first. Now, back to the record. It was Kora's friends within the Guild, not the police, who first refused to accept the story as told. Kate Williams, a professional strongwoman who performed under the stage name Volcana, had known Kora for years and was the first to voice her unease publicly. Unwilling to accept that a woman so thoroughly embedded in London social life had simply evaporated across an ocean without a word to anyone who loved her. It took another friend, the singer Lil Hawthorne, and her husband John Nash, to turn that unease into an actual police inquiry. Hawthorne and Nash happened to be personally acquainted with Scotland Yard Superintendent Frank Froest, and it was through that personal connection, rather than any formal complaint working its way up through ordinary channels, that the case landed on a desk willing to take it seriously. Chief Inspector Walter Dew was assigned to look into it, and on the 8th of July 1910, he called at Hilldrop Crescent to ask Dr. Crippen in person to account for his missing wife. What followed was, in its way, one of the most consequential interviews in the history of British criminal investigation, precisely because of how calmly it began. Crippen received Dew without apparent alarm and offered a new, more elaborate story than the one he had given the Guild. Kora had not died at all, he now claimed, but had run off to Chicago with another man, and he had invented the story of her death out of simple embarrassment to save face among their mutual friends, rather than admit his wife had left him for someone else. Dew, by his own later account, found the explanation plausible enough on its face and left Hilldrop Crescent without arresting anyone. He asked Crippen to provide a written statement to formally close the inquiry, an entirely routine request that Crippen agreed to without apparent hesitation. He never delivered it. The following day, the 9th of July, Crippen shaved off the distinctive moustache he had worn for years, closed up his affairs, and fled the country with Ethel Leneve, who travelled disguised as a teenage boy, the two of them presenting to fellow travellers as a father and son on a continental holiday. It was, of every decision Crippen made across the entire affair, the single clearest confession he ever offered, delivered not in words but in the simple, unmistakable act of running the moment a policeman's ordinary follow-up visit was expected rather than avoided. Dew, unsatisfied by the silence that followed, returned to Hilldrop Crescent to search the property properly. What his officers found on the 13th of July 1910, buried beneath the brick floor of the coal cellar, was a quantity of human remains, dismembered, and with the head, the limbs, and the skeleton itself never recovered at all. Toxicological analysis conducted by the pathologist William Willcox identified a lethal quantity of hyoscine hydrobromide, a drug Crippen had purchased in January of that year from a chemist on New Oxford Street, signing the poisons register in his own hand for a substance he had no ordinary professional use for and never offered a convincing explanation of afterward. The pathologist Bernard Spilsbury, still early in the career that would make him the most celebrated forensic witness of his generation, examined a fragment of skin recovered with the remains and identified what he believed to be scar tissue consistent with an abdominal surgery Kora Crippen was known to have undergone years earlier. On that identification, more than on any other single piece of evidence, the case against Hawley Harvey Crippen would ultimately be built. By the time that discovery reached the newspapers, Crippen and Leneve were already at sea, having boarded the SS Montrose at Antwerp on the 20th of July, bound for Quebec under the names John and Edmund Robinson. What Crippen could not have anticipated was that the ship's captain, Henry George Kendall, was an unusually attentive reader of the London papers, still full of his photograph, and an unusually observant judge of the two passengers now sharing his saloon. Kendall noticed the son's trousers pinned at the back to fit a smaller frame, noticed the father's lingering, unguarded glances at the boy, and became convinced, well before the Montrose had cleared the English coast, that he was looking at the two fugitives every paper in Britain was now describing. On the 22nd of July, Captain Kendall did something no ship's captain had ever done in quite this way before. He used the Montrose's Marconi wireless apparatus, a technology barely a decade old and still a novelty even to most sailors, to send a message ashore, strong suspicions that Crippen, the London cellar murderer, and his accomplice were travelling aboard as saloon passengers, disguised and continuing their voyage as if nothing at all had happened. It was the first time in history that wireless telegraphy had been used to pursue a fugitive across the ocean he had believed would carry him beyond reach entirely, and it reached Scotland Yard while the Montrose itself was still less than a full day into a crossing that would take nearly 2 weeks to complete. Consider what that meant for the balance of power in this particular chase. Crippen believed he had achieved something close to a clean escape, a slow, anonymous ocean crossing on an unremarkable liner, nearly 2 weeks in which London and its newspapers would recede further behind him with every mile. Instead, an invisible signal had already overtaken him before his own ship had cleared sight of the English coast, and every day he spent crossing the Atlantic in apparent safety was unknown to him, a day the authorities spent calmly preparing to be waiting for him on the other side. Chief Inspector Dew did not simply wait at the Canadian dock for the Montrose to arrive. He boarded a faster liner, the SS Laurentic, on the 23rd of July, and crossed the Atlantic in roughly 6 days, rather than the Montrose's slower fortnight. Arriving at Father Point on the St. Lawrence River on the 29th, days ahead of the ship he intended to intercept. On the 31st of July, disguised as a harbour pilot, Dew boarded the Montrose from a small boat well before it reached port, made his way to the saloon, and found Dr. Crippen exactly where Captain Kendall had said he would be. According to Dew's own later account, he removed his pilot's cap, said simply, "Good morning, Dr. Crippen. Do you know me?" and watched a man who had crossed an ocean under an assumed name recognize in an instant that there had never really been any distance between himself and London at all. There is a strange, almost vertiginous irony sitting at the center of this particular capture, and it deserves to be named plainly rather than left as background color to the more famous chase. For 4 centuries, a fugitive's best hope of escape had always been distance itself, the simple, reliable fact that news traveled only as fast as the fastest ship or horse could carry it, and that an ocean crossing bought a criminal real, physical time before the world on the other side could possibly know to look for him. Crippen fled at precisely the moment that calculation stopped being true, the first hunted man in history to discover, mid-voyage, that the ocean he had trusted to protect him had become, almost overnight, exactly as small and exactly as watched as the city streets he thought he had left behind. Both Crippen and Leneve were returned to England to face trial. Crippen alone stood accused of murder. Leneve was charged separately as an accessory after the fact, on the theory that she had known what he had done and helped him flee regardless. His trial opened at the Old Bailey's Central Criminal Court on the 18th of October 1910, before the Lord Chief Justice himself, and lasted 5 days, built substantially around Willcox's toxicology and Spilsbury's disputed scar tissue identification, against a defense that argued with real force that the fragment in question was nothing more than a fold of skin and connective tissue, incapable of proving anything about the surgical history of the person it had once belonged to. The lawyers arrayed against each other in that courtroom were themselves a small, bitter irony of the case. Crippen was prosecuted by Richard Muir, one of the most formidable barristers of his generation, a man whose reputation for methodical, relentless cross-examination preceded him into every courtroom he entered. When Crippen learned who had been assigned to prosecute him, he is reported to have said simply that he wished it had been anybody else, and that he feared the worst. His own defense, by contrast, fell to Alfred Tobin, a considerably less experienced counsel, not because anyone had judged Tobin the better man for the case, but because Crippen's solicitor had fallen into a dispute over fees with the clerk of Edward Marshall Hall, the era's most celebrated defense barrister, and lost the brief entirely over money rather than merit. A wealthier or better represented defendant might have had Marshall Hall's skill standing between him and Muir's cross-examination. Crippen, already a man of modest means after years in the patent medicine trade, did not, because I want you to hold 2 facts in your mind at exactly the same time here, because the tension between them is precisely what this record exists to preserve rather than smooth away. A jury in October 1910 sat and listened to Willcox describe hyoscine in the remains, and Spilsbury describe a fold of skin he was certain was Kora's own surgical scar, and found that testimony convincing enough to send a man to the gallows after only 27 minutes behind closed doors. A defense barrister with a fraction of Muir's experience raised real, substantive doubt about that same fragment of tissue and could not make it land in time, and modern forensic science, working from the very same preserved tissue slides nearly a century later, would eventually raise a question far larger than anyone sitting in that Old Bailey courtroom ever imagined they were being asked to answer. If a case built that quickly, on evidence that thin, can still generate this much doubt 100 years on, what does that tell you about how much genuine certainty a jury ever really has in any trial, in any era? Tell me what you think in the comments, and if this account is worth preserving honestly rather than tidily, consider subscribing before we finish it. Now, back to the record. The jury took 27 minutes to find Hawley Harvey Crippen guilty of the murder of his wife. Ethel Leneve was tried separately 3 days later, on the 25th of October, and acquitted, the court accepting that whatever she had known or suspected, the Crown could not prove she had known enough, early enough, to be guilty of assisting a murder, rather than simply loving a man who turned out to be a fugitive. The distinction the law drew between the two of them that week was, in its own way, exactly as narrow as the distinction between guilt and innocence had been in Crippen's own case, a matter of what could be proven rather than what might actually have been known, felt, or suspected inside a marriage and a household that only two people ever fully understood. Crippen was hanged at Pentonville Prison at 9 o'clock on the morning of the 23rd of November 1910, going, by the account of the prison chaplain and the witnesses present, to the gallows without protest and without ever publicly admitting his guilt. In his final letters, he continued to describe Ethel Leneve as the great love of his life and asked that a photograph of her be buried with him, a request the prison authorities honored. Whatever else Hawley Harvey Crippen was, the record does not support the idea that his feelings for Ethel Leneve were ever anything other than genuine, which makes the death of Kora Crippen, whatever exactly happened to her in that house, no less of a tragedy and no more of an excusable one. A man can be hanged in 27 minutes of jury deliberation and still leave behind a question nobody sitting in that courtroom thought they were actually being asked to settle. Ethel Leneve walked free on the strength of reasonable doubt about what she had known. Hawley Harvey Crippen hanged on the strength of a fold of tissue a defense barrister with real skill might have unraveled entirely had money and not merit decided who stood beside him at trial. Both verdicts were reached inside the same legal system, in the same fortnight, judged by the same basic standard of proof. If a case built on evidence that thin and that disputed still ended at the gallows, I want to know what you think that says about the standard of proof Edwardian Britain was actually willing to accept, and whether you believe it would hold up in a courtroom today. Subscribe if you want to see more cases held to that same honest scrutiny, and leave your answer in the comments below. Now, back to the record. Before we close the record on this one, consider the century of certainty that followed this case. Crippen's name became, almost immediately, a byword for a particular kind of quiet, respectable-seeming domestic killer, the mild-mannered doctor capable of the coldest imaginable act, buried literally beneath his own household's floor. Wax museums built his likeness. Newspapers invoked his name for decades whenever a husband went quiet about a missing wife. The wireless arrest became a founding legend of modern policing, told and retold as proof that no fugitive, however clever, could ever again outrun the technology closing in around him. And then, in 2007, forensic researchers at Michigan State University, led by David Foran, obtained a preserved sample from one of Bernd Spilsbury's own century-old pathology slides, the same fragment of tissue that had helped convict Crippen. and subjected it to mitochondrial DNA analysis unavailable to anyone in 1910. They compared the result against DNA drawn from 3 of Kora Crippen's own maternal relatives, a rare and reliable genetic marker shared uniquely among her mother's line. The 2 samples did not match. The mitochondrial sequences differed at a minimum of 5 separate positions, a divergence far too large to be explained by simple degradation or laboratory error. When the researchers tested further, seeking to confirm the remains were at least female, as Spilsbury had always assumed, they found instead genetic markers consistent with a male body. If those findings hold, and no consensus has yet definitively overturned them, then the remains buried beneath 39 Hilldrop Crescent were never Kora Crippens at all, and the single most famous forensic identification in the history of British criminal justice may have hanged a man on evidence that misidentified the very body at the center of the case. It does not prove Crippen was innocent of murder. It does not tell us who the remains actually belonged to, or how a second unidentified body came to be buried beneath his cellar floor, or where Kora Crippen herself might actually have gone if she did not die in that house in February of 1910. It simply proves that the certainty an Old Bailey jury reached in 27 minutes, and that an entire century of popular memory since has treated as settled fact, was built on a piece of evidence modern science can no longer fully stand behind. This is precisely the kind of case this record exists to preserve honestly, rather than close neatly for the sake of a tidy ending, not because the doubt exonerates anyone of murder, and not because a mismatch mitochondrial sequence undoes what Crippen did to the marriage and the trust that once sat inside 39 Hilldrop Crescent. It matters because the doubt is real, peer-reviewed, published in a real forensic journal, sitting in the open literature since 2007, and almost completely unknown to the millions of people who still repeat Crippen's name as shorthand for an open and shut case with a fittingly clever ending. If you think every true crime channel owes its audience that same level of honesty about what science has actually settled and what it has only ever assumed on a jury's behalf, subscribe and tell me in the comments which single detail in this case unsettled you the most. Now back to the record. Ethel Leneves's own life afterward deserves to be told, because it is one of the strangest quiet epilogues in the entire history of British crime. Acquitted and free, she sailed for Toronto within weeks of the verdict, working there as a typist under an assumed name for roughly 3 years before returning to London and settling, eventually, into a life almost aggressively ordinary. She married a clerk named Stanley Smith in 1915 and lived out the rest of her days in Croydon as Ethel Clara Smith, a housewife and mother whose neighbors had no idea they were sharing a street with the woman once accused of helping the most famous fugitive in the world escape justice. She was widowed in 1943, spent her evenings crocheting and listening to the wireless, the very technology that had once ended her flight across the Atlantic, and died quietly in a South London hospital on the 9th of August, 1967, at the age of 84. The woman who had crossed an ocean, disguised as a boy beside a man the whole world was hunting, spent the following 57 years being nobody in particular, which may have been, in the end, exactly the life she wanted. Camden Town has changed almost beyond recognition since 1910. Hilldrop Crescent itself was substantially rebuilt after bomb damage in the Second World War, and the house that once stood at number 39 no longer exists in the form Kora and Hawley Crippen knew it, though the street still carries the name and, for anyone who goes looking, still carries the case. Crippen's own remains lie in an unmarked prison grave at Pentonville, the traditional fate of the executed in his era, a mild, quiet man reduced finally to a name that most of the world still associates, without hesitation, with cold and calculated murder. Whether that association survives the next century of forensic science, the way it survived the last one, is a question this record cannot answer for you. It can only leave you, as the evidence itself now does, with considerably less certainty than the 27 minutes a jury once needed to decide it.